Hello, my name is Sophia Jochen. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm currently finishing my PhD at Freie Universität Berlin in Germany. This is me. And this is my paper today, Scarlet Runner Beans and Insurgent Citizenship in Charles Dickens' London. I want to begin with a December 1850 Household Words article about Wardian cases, miniature glass conservatories for popular houseplants like orchids and ferns. Dickens' Journals Online attributes backstreet conservatories to the inventor of the Wardian case, Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward, and to the sub-editor of Household Words, William Henry Wills. It's the article's introduction that interests me, because, quite curiously, it doesn't really have anything to do with Wardian cases. So my guess is that is the work of Wills, though of course Dickens, the journal's editor, may also have had a hand in it. In threading the mazes of squalor, in the purlieus of Whitechapel or Seven Dials in London, in the back settlements of Manchester, Liverpool and Dublin, or the wynds of the Cowgate and Canongate, where every sense is offended, where it is impossible to anticipate improvement in the moral while the physical condition of the denizens is low and comfortless, the sight of a flower on a window-sill imparts a gleam of hope and of respect. It redeems the surrounding debasement. You feel that however hard the toil and poor the sustenance of the cultivator, the higher faculties of enjoyment and of taste have not been ground away. This first paragraph makes a bold claim, that poor living conditions are not a consequence of poverty, but part of a social system that ensures the poor remain poor. Slum neighbourhoods are exposed as a viable part of the colonial capitalist system grinding away at their inhabitants' higher faculties. These people's environs are so low and comfortless that improvement is altogether impossible. Interestingly, the article specifies locations that were known to house a lot of Irish immigrants recently displaced by the Great Famine. The Irish had suffered under English and Scottish colonization for centuries and were considered as racially degenerate by many. Mazes of squalor, then, refers to the labyrinthine character of tenement architecture, but also to the fact that poverty in a world like this is virtually impossible to ever get out of. Intriguingly, a single flower suffices to redeem the debasement of poor living conditions. And this flower, for all its extraordinary impact, is by no means an anomaly. Every poor neighbourhood has its flower, Backstreet Conservatory suggests. And indeed, Mrs. Gamp's Holborn windowsill in Dickens' novel Martin Chuzzlewit has not just one, but 3 plants. There are more windowsill gardens in Gustave Doré's illustrations to Blanchard Gerald's London, a Pilgrimage. This is Union Place in Spitalfields in 1901 or 1902, though the most stunning windowsill gardens I have come across in a slum neighbourhood are these in Providence Place in 1909. And there's a peaky one over here. And yet, today more than ever, Victorian London is perceived as a place where nothing will grow. Jessie Oak-Taylor's passing assumption that the smoke and soot-choked air of the metropolis made it impossible to grow much of anything, native or otherwise, in the environs of London is not at all uncommon in Victorian eco-criticism. Dickens' writing has played a pivotal role in the construction of this 21st century fiction of the original age of emission city. It is a curious story of human impact on nature, which Anat Singh has pointed out is dangerously close to more familiar stories of human control of nature that are pivotal to colonialism and its disastrous environmental legacy. In this paper, I want to trouble this fiction of the city where nothing will grow by reattuning to the power of flowers on London windowsills. I suggest that learning to let ourselves be impressed again by plants like this we can get a glimpse of a different London, shaped both by colonial capitalist elites and by those they exploit. A city where imperial power is both focused and constantly contested. I'll return to backstreet conservatories for just a minute before moving on to Dickens' Scarlet Runner Beans. Cultivating that flower, the article suggests, its owner cultivates precisely those higher faculties that hard toil, poor sustenance, and substandard housing seek to eradicate: enjoyment and taste. Dickens believed that all people have a right to be amused, a right that came frequently under attack at the middle of the century. But the following paragraph seems to neutralize the flower's potential for amusement by referring it to liberalism's familiar chorus of self-help. The owner of the flower, it reckons, will in all probability be found more thrifty, better conducted, more self-reliant, etc., etc., than most of his neighbours. But this windowsill flower is not about each family fighting for themselves. On the contrary, the first paragraph derives its effective vigour precisely from the strong impression the flower has on the speaker, who is only walking in the street. Struck by that gleam of hope and of respect as he threads through the slum, the speaker is living proof that, unlike the Wardian cases that are the subject of the article, this flower is not just for the enjoyment of the gardener and their family, but for that of the whole street. Backstreet Conservatories here depicts a human slum inhabitant and a plant collaboratively engaging in public placemaking. The plant box with a road lamp suspended over it turns the slum, a place gauged towards hopelessness and debasement, into a place that offers enjoyment and taste, even a gleam of hope and of respect. This unidentified flower revolts against the dehumanizing living conditions of the very poor, and especially the Irish poor, under colonial capitalism. As importantly, it claims an active part in the production of the city as a lived reality, for both the plant and its cultivator. Windowsill gardening here constitutes a Victorian version of what Faranac Mirvtab and Shana Wills term practices of insurgent citizenship. The urban poor shape their environment through resistance and insurgency, obstructing the development of urban life spaces according to the interests of a colonial capitalist elite only. I beg your pardon, the beans. Thus Tartar introduces himself to his neighbour, Neville Landless, in Dickens' unfinished novel The Mystery of Edwin Drood. A social exile and murder suspect, Neville spends most of his time shut up in a set of rented attic rooms with, quote, sloping ceilings, cumbrous, rusty locks and grates, slowly mouldering withal, end quote. Not quite slum conditions, maybe, but still palpably precarious. Tartar grows scarlet runner beans, mignonette, and wallflower in boxes outside his garret window next door. And he has noticed, excuse me, that you seem to like my gardener loft here. And Neville does like it, very much in fact. Here again, it is not just the gardener's own higher faculties that this garden nourishes, but that of the whole neighbourhood. The sight of a flower on a windowsill suffices. The scarlet runner beans among Tartar's choice of plants are important. Like the windowsill gardener in backstreet conservatories, who has erected a miniature fence and 5-barred gate, which forms the boundary of his flower pots and mignonette box outside his window, Tartar is messing with the boundary of his rented rooms as he appropriates spaces that don't technically belong to him. Both are acts of guerrilla gardening, which, as Chiara Tsetomar, Martin Zonderman, and Susan Norrie explain, involves extemporaneous green interventions for greening the city. The morphology of scarlet runner beans specifically allows Tartar to garden spaces that would otherwise be far out of his reach, and thus to achieve a greater effect. Scarlet runner beans were one of the key plants which Thomas Fairchild recommended to urban gardeners in a London heavily polluted by coal smoke in his immensely popular 1722 book, The City Gardener. containing the most experienced method of cultivating and ordering such evergreens, fruit trees, flowering shrubs, flowers, exotic plants, etc., as will be ornamental and thrive best in the London gardens. The scarlet bean, so called from the colour of its flowers, makes a fine appearance when it is in blossom. The spikes of flowers are pretty long and well set, and if they have liberty and a support from their beginning to grow, will hold flowering several months. Even based in a small pot, scarlet runner beans will develop yards of tendrils full of decorative flowers and later fruit, which will eagerly fill large spaces, such as that between the garret windows of two neighbouring houses. That's the reason for Tartar's visit. If you would like a little more of it, he says to Neville with reference to his garden, I could throw out a few lines and stays between my windows and yours, which the runners would take to directly. According to Fairchild, the Virginia creeper, another climbing plant, was well known to grow in the closest places in the city, even where there is not sun at all. There is hardly a street, court, or alley in London, he explains, without some examples of what I relate of. In Dickens' London, scarlet runner beans take the place of Virginia creeper. They are the go-to plant for urban gardeners in Dickens, and a considerable part of their appeal clearly lies in their being trainable. In Martin Chuzzlewit, for example, Mr. Mould has a rural screen of scarlet runners trained on strings before the window of his sitting room deep in the city, a detail that has been left out in the BBC's popular TV adaptation of the novel. No beans here, as have the pots on Mrs. Gamp's windowsill. In Dombey and Son, under very different circumstances, the inhabitants of Stagg's Gardens, soon to be demolished for the arrival of the railway, trained scarlet beans on the little squalid patches of ground before their houses. Luscious displays of its bright red blossoms are characteristic of Dickens' streets, courts and alleys, and it's important to recognise that London's pot gardens provided not just guerrilla gardeners with the means of shaping the lived reality of the city, but the bean plants too. Unlike their human caretakers, scarlet runner beans have a story. The plant that colonises London's public spaces so readily in Dickens is, like almost all plants we come across in Dickens' London, an import. Since the retreat of the ice sheet that covered northwestern Europe during the last glacial maximum about 20 to 25,000 years ago, England has been forest country, and not many plants other than forest plants evolved here. Currants are one of the very few plants Fairchild recommends to London gardeners that are not, in fact, exotic. With the onset of coloniality, a huge number of new and often more efficient plants entered British gardens and fields. For example, the arrival of potatoes from South America eventually rendered skirrets, themselves an earlier import from China, obsolete. Scarlet runner beans originated in the mountains of Central America. The Cultural History of Plants, a very helpful book, tells us that they arrived in Britain in the 16th century, presumably via Spain. Scarlet runner beans were in London on very different terms than their human cultivators. They had not been dispossessed and driven into labour like the Irish by English colonisation, or like many rural English by agrarian capitalism. Plants thrive on migration. They're not particularly good at dispersing their seed widely without help, because mostly they're not mobile. They had depended on birds for that for a long time before mammals and finally humans came along. Of course, a scarlet runner bean won't grow anywhere you drop a seed. But where the climatic conditions are good enough, an imported plant will often do better than in its original habitat, because, at least for a while, it might escape those pathogens that have evolved with it. But whilst Spanish colonizers helped scarlet runner beans to Europe, they did not take this plant from the wild. The Cultural History of Plants explains that indigenous peoples in the central highlands of Mexico and Guatemala had developed scarlet runner beans as a crop for at least 3.5 millennia before Spanish colonization in the 16th century. So far I've not found out much, about how scarlet runner beans were cultivated, or in fact by whom precisely. But since they were grown as a source of food, it is likely that indigenous growers eventually figured out that the seed of plants bearing lots of flowers and beans would be more likely to produce plants bearing lots of flowers and beans in the next season too. The scarlet runners colonizing the public spaces of Dickens' London were thus not just beans, but the result of an interspecies relationship with indigenous Central American peoples. They would reliably grow large and luscious, benefiting both the bean species and the urban gardeners in London because of millennia of cultivation work by these peoples. The Spanish appropriated the scarlet runner bean cultigen from its indigenous cultivators as they dispossessed, colonized, and killed many of them. The bean arrived in Europe very much as a prize of civilization, that is, of white Western European supremacy. Whereas its tender pods, mature seeds, and starchy roots were staples of its Central American cultivators' diet, the English first grew it only for its flowers, which they used in nosegays. When more than a century later, Fairchild recommended scarlet runner beans to Londoners as plants, he did so in the belief that gardening would instill industry in the poor. Where a little is only to be had, we should be content with a little. Industry will always find out more. 'Tis money will be the consequence of industry, and that will always go for its full value, and bring us as many acres as it's worth. And, in proportion to the money men get, so may their gardens be larger and better garnished. I very much doubt that anyone growing beans on a windowsill or on a rooftop in Victorian London managed to garden their way to acres of land. But Fairchild's little book, so unambivalently grounded in economic liberalism, provided people who were systematically deprived of skills and land with ideas for shaping life in the city anyway. In Dickens' London, scarlet runner beans specifically cut through the smoke-blackened squalor to assert the right to the metropole of those not recognised as full citizens, the right to the metropole of displaced Irish colonial subjects, of colonised indigenous peoples in the highlands of Guatemala and Mexico, of English poor and working classes, and, not least, of this plant that ties all these human beings together. Dickens' scarlet runner beans, I believe, can take us into a Victorian London where civilization has by no means conquered nature, where, on the contrary, human and plant lives are inextricably entangled, albeit in ways that are strange to us. They might even take us to a better vantage point for understanding what the idea of a Victorian London where nothing will grow really means to us. Thank you.